Chapter 2 from Born a Crime. Apartheid was perfect racism. It took centuries to develop, starting all the way back in 1652 when the Dutch East India Company landed at the Cape of Good Hope and established a trading colony, Kaapstad, later known as Cape Town, a rest stop for ships traveling between Europe and India. To impose white rule, the Dutch colonists went to war with the natives, ultimately developing a set of laws to subjugate and enslave them. When the British took over Cape Colony, the descendants of the original Dutch settlers trekked inland and developed their own language, culture, and customs, eventually becoming their own people. The Afrikaners, the white tribe of Africa. The British abolished slavery in name, but kept it in practice. They did so because in the mid-1800s, in what had been written off as a near worthless way station on the route to the Far East, a few lucky capitalists stumbled upon the richest gold and diamond reserves in the world. And an endless supply of expendable bodies was needed to go in the ground and get it all out. As the British Empire fell, the Afrikaners rose up to claim South Africa as his rightful inheritance. To maintain power in the face of the country's rising and restless black majority, government realized they needed a newer and more robust set of tools. They set up a formal commission to go out and study institutionalized racism all over the world. They went to Australia, they went to the Netherlands, they went to America. They saw what worked, what didn't. Then they came back and published a report, and the government used that knowledge to build the most advanced system of racial oppression known to man. Apartheid was a police state, a system of surveillance and laws designed to keep black people under total control. A full compendium of laws would run more than 3,000 pages and weigh approximately 10 pounds. But the general thrust of it should be easy enough for any American to understand. In America, you had the forced removal of the native people onto reservations coupled with slavery, followed by segregation. Imagine all three of those things happening to the same group of people at the same time. That was apartheid. I grew up in South Africa during apartheid, which was awkward because I was raised in a mixed family, with me being the mixed one in the family. My mother, Patricia Nombilioso, and I probably botched that, I'm sorry, Noah, is black. My father, Robert, is white, Swiss German to be precise. During apartheid, one of the worst crimes you could commit was having sexual relations with a person of another race. Needless to say, my parents committed that crime. In any society built on institutionalized racism, race mixing doesn't merely challenge the system as unjust, it reveals the system as unsustainable and incoherent. Race mixing proves that races can mix, and in a lot of cases, want to mix. Because a mixed person embodies the rebuke to the logic of the system, race mixing becomes a crime worse than treason. There were mixed kids in South Africa 9 months after the first Dutch boats hit the beach in Table Bay. Just like in America, the colonists here had their way with the native women, as colonists so often do. Unlike in America, where anyone with one drop of black blood automatically became black, in South Africa, mixed people came to be classified as their own separate group, neither black nor white, but what we call colored. Colored people, black people, white people, and Indian people were forced to register their race with the government. Based on those classifications, millions of people were uprooted and relocated. Indian areas were segregated from the colored areas, which were segregated from black areas, all of them segregated from white areas and separated from one another by buffer zones of empty land. Laws were passed prohibiting sex between Europeans and natives, laws that were later amended to prohibit sex between whites and all non-whites. The government went to insane lengths to try to enforce these new laws. The penalty for breaking them was 5 years in prison. If an interracial couple got caught, God help them, the police would kick down the door, drag the couple out, beat them, and arrest them. At least that's what they did to the black person. If you ask my mother whether she ever considered the ramifications of having a mixed child under apartheid, she will say no. She had a level of fearlessness that you have to possess to take on something like she did. If you stop to consider the ramifications, you'll never do anything. Still, it was a crazy, reckless thing to do. A million things had to go right for us to slip through the cracks the way we did for as long as we did. Under apartheid, if you were a black man, you worked on a farm or in a factory or in a mine. If you were a black woman, you worked in a factory or as a maid. Those were pretty much your only options. My mother didn't want to work in a factory. She was a horrible cook and never have stood for some white lady telling her what to do all day. So, true to her nature, she found an option that was not among the ones presented to her. She took a secretarial course, a typing class. At the time, a black woman learning how to type was like a blind person learning how to drive. It's an admirable effort, but you're unlikely to ever be called upon to execute the task. By law, white-collar jobs and skilled labor jobs were reserved for whites. Black people didn't work in offices. My mom, however, was a rebel, and fortunately for her, her rebellion came along at the right moment. In the early 1980s, the South African government began making minor reforms in an attempt to quell international protests over the atrocities and human rights abuses of apartheid. Among those reforms was the token hiring of black workers in low-level white-collar jobs, like typists. Through an employment agency, my mom got a job as a secretary at ICI, a multinational pharmaceutical company in Braamfontein, a suburb of Johannesburg. When my mom started working, she lived with my grandmother in Soweto, the township where the government had relocated my family decades before. But my mother was unhappy at home, and she was 22. She ran away to live in downtown Johannesburg. There was only one problem. It was illegal for black people to live there. The ultimate goal of apartheid was to make South Africa a white country, with every black person stripped of his or her citizenship and relocated to live in the homelands, the Bantustans, semi-sovereign black territories that were in reality puppet states of the government in Pretoria. But this so-called white country could not function without black labor to produce its wealth, which meant black people had to be allowed to live near white areas and townships, government-planned ghettos built to house black workers like Soweto. The township was where you lived, but your status as a laborer was the only thing that permitted you to stay there. If your papers were revoked for any reason, you could be deported back to the homelands. To leave the township for work in the city, or for any other reason, you had to carry a pass with your ID number. Otherwise, you could be arrested. There was also a curfew. After a certain hour, blacks had to be back home in the township or risk arrest. My mother didn't care. She was determined to never go home again. So, she stayed in town, hiding and sleeping in public restrooms until she learned the rules of navigating the city from the other black women who had contrived to live there. Many of these women were Xhosa. They spoke my mother's language and showed her how to survive. They taught her how to dress up in a pair of maid's overalls to move around the city without being questioned. They also introduced her to white men who were willing to rent out flats in town. A lot of these men were foreigners, Germans and Portuguese, who didn't care about the law. Thanks to her job, my mom had money to pay rent. She met a German fellow through one of her friends, and he agreed to let her a flat in his name. She moved in and bought a bunch of maid's overalls to wear. She was caught and arrested many times for not having her ID on the way home from work, for being in a white area after hours. The penalty for violating the pass laws was 30 days in jail or a fine of 50 rand, nearly half her month's salary. She would scrape together money, pay the fine, and go right back about her business. My mom's secret flat was in a neighborhood called Hillborough. She lived in number 203. Down the corridor was a tall, brown-haired, brown-eyed Swiss-German expat named Robert. He lived in 206. As a former trading colony, South Africa has always had a large expatriate community. People find their way here. Tons of Germans, lots of Dutch. Hillborough at the time was the Greenwich Village of South Africa. It was a thriving scene, cosmopolitan and liberal. There were galleries and underground theaters where artists and performers dared to speak up and criticize the government in front of integrated crowds. There were restaurants and nightclubs, a lot of them foreign-owned, that served a mixed clientele. Black people who hated the status quo and white people who simply thought it was ridiculous. These people would have a secret get-togethers, too, usually in someone's flat or in an empty basement that had been converted into clubs. Integration by its nature was a political act, but the get-togethers themselves weren't political at all. People would meet up and hang out, have parties. My mom threw herself into that scene. She was always out at some club, some party, dancing, meeting people. She was a regular at the Hillborough Tower, one of the tallest buildings in Africa at the time. It had a nightclub with a rotating dance floor on the top floor. It was an exhilarating time, but still dangerous. Sometimes the restaurants and clubs would get shut down, sometimes not. Sometimes the performers and patrons would get arrested, sometimes not. It was a roll of the dice. My mother never knew whom to trust, who might turn her into the police. Neighbors would report on one another. Living alone in the city, not being trusted and not being able to trust, my mother started spending more and more time in the company of someone with whom she felt safe, the tall Swiss man down the corridor in 206. He was 46, she was 24. He was quiet and reserved, she was wild and free. She would stop by his flat to chat. They'd go to underground get-togethers, go dancing at the nightclub with the rotating dance floor, and something clicked. The fact that this man was prevented by law from having a family with my mother was part of the attraction. She wanted a child, not a man stepping in to run her life. For my father's part, I know that for a long time he kept saying no to fathering a child. Eventually, he said yes. 9 months after that yes, on February 20th, 1984, my mother checked into Hillsborough Hospital for a scheduled C-section delivery. Estranged from her family, pregnant by a man she could not be seen with in public, she was alone. The doctors took her up to the living room, cut her open her belly, and reached in and pulled out a half-white, half-black child who violated any number of laws, statutes, and regulations. I was born a crime. When the doctors pulled me out, there was an awkward moment where they said, that's a very light-skinned baby. A quick scan of the delivery room revealed no man standing around to take credit. Who was the father, they asked. His father is from Swaziland, my mother said, referring to the tiny landlocked kingdom in the west of South Africa. They probably knew she was lying, but they accepted it because they needed an explanation. Under apartheid, the government labeled everything on your birth certificate. Race, tribe, nationality, everything had to be categorized. My mother lied and said I was born in Ka-Ngwani, the semi-sovereign homeland for Swazi people living in South Africa. So my birth certificate doesn't say that I'm Xhosa, which technically I am. And it doesn't say that I'm Swiss, which the government wouldn't allow. It just says that I'm from another country. My father isn't on my birth certificate. Officially, he's never been my father. And my mother was prepared for him not to be involved. She'd rented a new flat for herself in Joubert Park, the neighborhood adjacent to Hillsborough, and that's where she took me when she left the hospital. But once I existed, my father realized he couldn't have a son living around the corner and not be a part of my life. So the three of us formed a kind of family as much as our peculiar situation would allow. I lived with my mom. We'd sneak around and visit my dad when we could. Where most children are proof of their parents' love, I was proof of their criminality. The only time I could be with my father was indoors. If we left the house, he'd have to walk across the street from us. My mom and I used to go to Joubert Park all the time. It's the Central Park of Johannesburg. Beautiful gardens, a zoo, a giant chessboard with human-sized pieces that people would play with. My mother tells me that once, when I was a toddler, my dad tried to go with us. We were in the park, he was walking a good bit away from us, and I ran after him screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy!" People started looking. He panicked and ran away. I thought it was a game and just kept chasing him. I couldn't walk with my mother either. A light-skinned child with a black woman would raise too many questions. When I was a newborn, she could wrap me up and take me anywhere, but very quickly, that was no longer an option. I was a giant baby, an enormous child. When I was 1, you'd have thought I was 2. When I was 2, you'd have thought I was 4. There was no way to hide me. My mom, same as she'd done with her flat and with her maid's uniforms, found the cracks in the system. It was illegal to be mixed, to have a black parent and a white parent, but it was not illegal to be colored, to have 2 parents who were both colored. So my mom moved me around the world as a colored child. She found a crochet in a colored area where she could leave me while she was at work. There was a colored woman named Queen who lived in our block of flats. When we wanted to go out to the park, my mom would invite her to go with us. Queen would walk next to me and act like she was my mother, and my mother would walk a few steps behind like she was the maid working for the colored woman. I've got dozens of pictures of me walking with this woman who looks like me but who isn't my mother. And the black woman standing behind us who looks like she's photobombing the picture, well, that's my mom. When we didn't have a colored woman to walk with us, my mom would risk walking me on her own. She would hold my hand or carry me, but if the police showed up, she would have to drop me and pretend I wasn't hers. When I was born, my mother hadn't seen her family in 3 years, but she wanted me to know them and wanted them to know me. So the prodigal daughter returned. We lived in town, but I would spend weeks at a time with my grandmother in Soweto, often during the holidays. I have so many memories from the place that, in my mind, it's like we lived there too. Soweto Township was a city unto itself with a population of nearly 1 million. There were only 2 roads in and out. That was so the military could lock us in, quell any rebellion. And if the monkeys ever went crazy and tried to break out of their cage, the Air Force could fly over and bomb everyone to oblivion. Growing up, I never knew that my grandmother lived in the center of a bullseye. In the city, as difficult as it was to get around, we managed. Enough people were out and about, black, white, and colored, going to and from work that we could get lost in the crowd. But only black people were permitted in Soweto. It was much harder to hide someone who looked like me, and the government was watching much more closely. In the white areas, you rarely saw the police, and if you did, it was officer-friendly in his collared shirt and pressed pants. In Soweto, the police were an occupying army. They didn't wear collared shirts, they wore riot gear. They were militarized. They operated in teams known as flying squads because they would swoop in and out of nowhere, riding in armored personnel carriers. Hippos, we called them, tanks with enormous tires and slotted holes in the side of the vehicle to fire their guns out at you. You didn't mess with a hippo. You saw one, you ran. That was a fact of life. Playing in my grandmother's house, I'd hear gunshots, screams, tear gas being fired into crowds. My memories of the hippos and the flying squads come from when I was 5 or 6, when apartheid was finally coming apart. I never saw the police before that because we could never risk the police seeing me. Whenever we went to Soweto, my grandmother refused to let me outside. If she was watching me, it was no, 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 he doesn't leave the house. Behind the wall, in the yard, I could play, but not in the street. And that's where the rest of the boys and girls were playing, in the street. My cousins, the neighborhood kids, they'd open the gate and head out and roam free and came back at dusk. I'd beg my grandmother to go outside. Please, please, can I go play with my cousins? No, they're going to take you. For the longest time, I thought she meant that the other kids were going to steal me, but she was talking about the police. Children would be taken. Children were taken. The wrong color kid in the wrong color area, and the government could come in, strip your parents of custody, and haul you off to an orphanage. To police the townships, the government relied on its network of impimpios. I probably botched that, I'm sorry. The anonymous snitches who'd inform our suspicious activity. There were also the blackjacks, black people who worked for the police. My grandmother's neighbor was a blackjack. She had to make sure he wasn't watching when she smuggled me in and out of the house. My gran still tells the story of when I was 3 years old and fed up with being a prisoner, I dug a hole under the gate in the driveway, wiggled through and ran off. Everyone panicked. A search party went out and tracked me down. I had no idea how much danger I was putting everyone in. The family could have been deported. My gran could have been arrested. My mom might have gone to prison, and I probably would have been packed off to a home for colored kids. So I was kept inside. Other than those few instances of walking in the park, the flashes of memory I have from when I was young are almost all indoors. Me with my mom in her tiny flat, me by myself at Gran's. I didn't have any friends. I didn't know any kids besides my cousins. I wasn't a lonely kid. I was just good at being alone. I'd read books, play with the toy that I had, make up imaginary worlds. I lived inside my head. I still live inside my head. To this day, you can leave me alone for hours and I'm perfectly happy entertaining myself. I have to remember to be with people. Obviously, I was not the only child born to black and white parents during apartheid. Traveling around the world today, I meet other mixed South Africans all the time. Our stories start off identically. We're around the same age. Their parents met at some underground party in Hillborough, Cape Town. They lived in an illegal flat. The difference is that in virtually every other case, they left. The white parents smuggled them out through Lesotho or Botswana, and they grew up in exile in England or Germany or Switzerland because being a mixed family under apartheid was just that unbearable. Once Mandela was elected, we could finally live freely. Exiles started to return. I met my first one when I was around 17. He told me his story, and I was like, wait, what? You mean we could have left? That was an option? Imagine being thrown out of an airplane. You hit the ground and break all your bones. You go to the hospital and you heal and you move on and finally put the whole thing behind you. And then one day somebody tells you about parachutes. That's how I felt. I couldn't understand why we'd stayed. I went straight home and asked my mom, why? Why didn't we just leave? Why didn't we go to Switzerland? Because I'm not Swiss, she said as stubborn as ever. This is my country. Why should I leave?